Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week we're finishing up the Iliad. Last week we talked about the gods and the poetic structure, and then this week we're going to be talking about the human characters and kind of the overall themes of the poem. So let's get into it. So the Iliad is really interesting because it doesn't follow the kind of structure that we would sort of expect today. Sort of a beginning, middle, and end of, there's a hero who sets out to do something, he faces trials, and then overcomes it in the end, and then things are good. The Iliad is a little bit different, so we're going to start off by talking about Achilles himself. He's sort of the most important character in this poem, but his role in the poem is really interesting because it doesn't follow sort of the kind of structure that you'd expect to see in like a mythical story. One thing about Achilles that I think modern readers might struggle with is that he doesn't behave the way you'd expect sort of a modern day hero to behave. So when you get to the end of the poem and you've got Achilles, who's been sitting out the war for most of the time, throwing kind of what seems like a temper tantrum for most of the poem. He's been sitting out the conflict, the Achaeans have been losing, and then after Patroclus joins, dressed in his armor, and goes to fight, and he's killed because he goes after Hector, Achilles then rejoins the fight and becomes kind of this killing machine, and then he fights and kills Hector, who's sort of the most noble hero on the Trojan side, and desecrates his body and is sort of still seems to be really caught up in the grief over the loss of Patroclus. And then the kind of attitude that he has throughout seems a little off to modern readers because we are okay with flawed heroes. We love them and anti-heroes and everything, but when you have a character who seems to be like 80% flaws and 20% virtues, it can be kind of hard to connect with the character. And Achilles is a great character, and I think we need to talk about him. But I wanted to talk about sort of the cultural differences between then and now, and also the way that we're meant to sort of see Achilles in the poem. So starting off, I guess the question that one would ask is Achilles the protagonist of the Iliad? He's not in it for most of it. He shows up at the very beginning, and then he sits out for most of it, and he shows up kind of at the end. There's all that stuff that happens, but is he the protagonist? So, because this is an ensemble cast for the most part. You've got gods and humans, you've got a bunch of different characters on both sides of the conflict, and we get insight into their mindset, their wants, their needs, all that fun stuff. But the invocation to Calliope the Muse at the beginning of the poem does mention Achilles specifically. This is a poem about the wrath of Achilles, and so I would say that he is sort of the most important figure in the poem, but he doesn't behave the way we would expect a protagonist of kind of an epic story would. And there's if you look at epic fantasy, for example, you've got characters who are part of an ensemble, and so they're not necessarily the main character, but they still have like a character arc within the story that feels satisfying in terms of like modern conventions. One thing that we do a lot is we try to cast heroes in ancient Greek mythology through the lens of kind of our modern sensibilities. And you don't want to do that because there's this push to sort of cast them as morally good, upstanding, heroic characters in the modern sense. Really good examples of this are the movies Jason and the Argonauts and Clash of the Titans, which are two of my favorite movies. I love them so much. But in those, we get Jason and Perseus, and they're very much like Hollywood leading guy. They're handsome, they're virtuous, they're good people. We want to see them win. There's kind of the underdogs for some of it, but they come out in the end and they kind of get the girl at the end, and we're sort of happy for them because they're good heroes that we can look up to, and they've accomplished something great. the real heroes in the stories are sometimes a lot messier. Now, Perseus, for the most part, is a pretty heroic character. He does everything that he does because he's trying to save his mother, who is being kind of preyed on by a king who kind of wants her. And he sends Perseus on this, what he thinks is an impossible task, to kill Medusa, in order to kind of get rid of him. He doesn't think he'll actually succeed, but he just wants to get rid of him. And so Perseus is helped by the gods and the Grey Women, and he does end up killing Medusa, and along the way he saves Andromeda from Cetus, and he has other adventures as well, but for the most part, like, he's a pretty good guy. Now, from the point of view of Medusa, he's probably not a great character, but he doesn't know anything about Medusa. He's just told, go take care of this monster, and the gods are like, yeah, you should take care of this monster, we'll help you, and they give him the tools to do it, and so he says, all right, let's do this. And so if you have a story set from the point of view of Medusa, and that's a whole other can of worms, he's not going to come across very well. And there are versions of the story where, like, he's the one who kills Ariadne. That's not in every version of the story. Obviously, there's lots of different versions of what happens to Ariadne at the end. But overall, Perseus is a pretty good hero. But then we've got someone like Jason. Jason is not as morally upstanding as we would like. When he's on the Argo, for the most part, that whole voyage, there's lots of good stuff there, but he does betray his wife Medea. He marries someone else, and I know he kind of does it for political reasons, but... Oh, there's a cat coming. Here we go. Yep, she has things to say. Okay. He kind of betrays Medea, and she obviously destroys him for it. And kind of at the end of his life, Jason is sort of left in the wreckage of the Argo, and I think a piece of the Argo falls on him and kills him when it collapses. And so it's kind of an ignominious end for Jason. But for the most part, people looked at Jason as a hero, even though he didn't do super great things. Another great example is Heracles. He killed his wife and his kids, and he spent a long time atoning for that. Ultimately, he was sort of ascended to Olympus, became a demigod. But, you know, Heracles as a character wasn't necessarily what we would call an upstanding, virtuous character. He was a great character, and he did great things, but in terms of him being like a good, squeaky clean person, no, that's not who he is. So coming back to Achilles, the thing that people like about Achilles is that he accomplishes great feats. He's known for being incredibly fast, he's very strong, he wields a spear that no one else can wield because it's too heavy. His duel with Aeneas is really incredible. The gods actually have to pull Aeneas away. Aeneas is a great hero in his own right, but he is not on Achilles' level in the slightest. And so even though, you know, audiences in that time would hear the story and they would hear about Achilles sitting out the war because of kind of a temper tantrum for the most part, and then desecrating an opposing hero's body, and like, they wouldn't have seen that as, oh, well, he's a bad person and so we shouldn't look up to him. What they would have said is, like, he's a flawed person, as we all are, but because he does great things and he's a very impressive character, we can still sort of treat him like a hero. So even in Achilles' final conflict with Hector, Hector runs away from him because he knows that he can't defeat Achilles at all. Even though in the past we've seen Hector do quite a lot of really incredible things. He's the one who killed Patroclus, and Patroclus was a good fighter, but, you know, also Patroclus was killed because the gods swept in and, like, removed the armor from him and left him sort of exposed on the battlefield. So, you know, that's something else as well. But we have seen Hector fight other characters, and he is a good, powerful character. And so Achilles is notable because he's strong and fast, and he's able to do things that no one else can do. He's a brilliant tactician. He commands the Myrmidons, which is kind of a tribe from Greece, and he commands them, and they're known for being really good fighters. And so if we see something like that today, where it's like they're really powerful and they're strong and they do good things, but they're also kind of bad people morally, we would have more of a struggle with that. And so this is a different kind of mindset. So, we can put modern sensibilities on modern characters, that's fine. But the way that the Greeks would have viewed Achilles is like, he was a great fighter, and it's a shame that he was flawed because he could have ruled nations and changed the world. So there's kind of a tragedy inherent to the character as well. So they were aware of his flaws, but they still considered him a great hero. And that also kind of points to something else that I mentioned. In the previous lecture, I talked about the concept of fate or destiny. And that is something that weighs on Achilles quite a bit through this poem. Now, he's been told that he has two options, and neither of them is set in stone. He can choose one or the other. He can either stay and fight in Troy, and he'll die young, but he'll live sort of in history forever as a renowned hero, and his deeds will be talked about forever. So he'll kind of achieve literary immortality. Or he can go home and he'll live a good long life, he'll be healthy, and he'll, die at a very old age, but he won't be remembered at all for anything that he's done. So he won't have any kind of reputation whatsoever. And that's kind of seen as a cowardly choice. But it is a choice. And in this poem, we see him sort of thinking about that. And I think a lot of his reaction to what happens at the beginning stems from him wrestling with that choice, because he still has that choice to make, and he can get out of it. If he leaves and goes home, then he can live a long life, and there's all that. But if he stays, he's going to die young, here in Troy, and his life isn't going to last much longer than that. So his reaction to Agamemnon at the beginning seems like it's really an overreaction. It seems like he's being petulant, childish. He says, well, if you take my war bride from me just because you don't have one, then I'm going to sit this war out, and I hope you all lose, and I'm not going to fight until the fighting, reaches my own camp, kind of thing. And so it seems like he's being really petulant and childish, but we do get a little bit of insight into his mindset during this time, because we see that he is considering whether or not he should just leave or stay. And that really bothers him. And so it's not so much that he's being childish, it's that he's wrestling with a big existential question about his own destiny and how he has control over how many days left he has to live, kind of thing. And so that is part of why he kind of holds himself back for so long, because we know that his decision to hold himself back isn't a great one. We see Odysseus talk to him, we see Patroclus talk to him and try to convince him. And these are people that we're kind of meant to trust, where, these are intelligent people, and this is also, Patroclus knows him really well. He's probably his best friend in the whole world. And so we are aware that what he's doing isn't the correct thing. It's not, it doesn't make any sense. They don't understand why he's drawing this out so long, even when Agamemnon apologizes and offers to give him a ton of gifts and give him back Briseis so he can have her back. So he's wrestling with some big questions about his own destiny. And so we shouldn't see it as just him being childish. He's scared that he has to make a choice about how long he has to live. And so in that sense, even though Achilles is away from the fighting for a big portion of the poem is still about him. We see how important he is to the Achaean forces, and his demand that Zeus not help the Achaeans is a big driving point of tension in the poem, because we see for a long period of time the Greeks are really good fighters, but they're having a hard time keeping up with the Trojans. And this is important because the Trojans have been blockaded for a long time. So they're running low on food, they're running low on supplies, but their fighters are genuinely really good. And so without the gods helping them, the Trojans are able to make inroads, and they're able to get to the Achaean camp just because they're that good at fighting. And so it's implied that because Achilles isn't fighting with them, they're losing. And it's like he's so important that his contribution keeps the Achaeans from being defeated. And this is huge because the Achaeans have really good people on their side, especially like Ajax, son of Telamon, the big Ajax. There's two of them. Big Ajax is amazing, and he's like one of my favorite characters in the story. But even with him on their side, they're still losing. And so when Achilles rejoins the fighting at the end after Patroclus is killed, it changes the balance of everything, because Zeus sort of drops his ban on everyone helping, and so all the gods are able to sort of get involved in the fighting. And at one point, it's pretty brief, but the gods are actually fighting each other. I know I said in the last thing that this poem isn't about the gods fighting each other, but in this last section, we do have a brief moment where the gods are at war with each other. There's even this kind of almost comedic moment where we cut to Hades, and he's sort of like shrieking and covering his head because there's like earthquakes and explosions, and he's worried that the fighting between the gods is going to crack the earth open and sort of expose the realm of Hades to like mortal man on the surface and the gods, because they don't want to see that. It's kind of like you get this image of like a bug under a rock that's terrified that the rock is going to get pulled away and reveal them. It's kind of funny. But so Achilles rejoining the fight changes everything. And so we even have the gods joining in. They don't fight for very long. I think at one point, Zeus does say, let's just sit back and watch. But it causes a big change in things. So just one man rejoining the fight turns the tide of war. At one point, he goes to battle against the river Scamander itself, because he kills so many Trojans that their bodies are like stopping up the river. And so the river god, like the incarnation of the river, fights him and tells him to stop. And I think Hera gets Hephaestus to like burn the river and like evaporate a whole portion of it with like divine fire, because she's on Achilles' side. And so this poem is about Achilles, even though he isn't in a big part of it, because his involvement in the conflict is the driver of everything. It makes things either move or not move. And so after Patroclus is killed, Achilles rejoins the fighting, and he becomes such a nightmarish force of destruction that he's finally able to beat the Trojans back far enough that they're able to have a proper funeral for Patroclus. Because before Achilles joined, they were having trouble even getting Patroclus's body back to the Greek camp, because the Trojans wanted to keep it as like a trophy. And there's one point where there's like a group of people, and they're all holding on to Patroclus, like surrounding him. It's described that he's sort of stretched out like a hide, which is kind of sad. But and they're trying to get him back to the Greek camp, and the Trojans are fighting just like crazy to get him back because they want to keep him as a trophy. And I think Hector at one point even like drags Patroclus's body, and they fight over it. And so once Achilles is there, he's able to beat the Trojans back enough that they can finally do like a proper funeral for Patroclus. And they burn his body, and then they have some like funeral games afterwards to celebrate his life. They do like a competition sort of thing. And it's funny that like Achilles being out of the fighting, it's almost like the rhythm of everything was off. And so as long as he wasn't fighting, things were just not going well, and they weren't going the way they were supposed to. But then when Achilles rejoins and then he kills Hector, he sort of stops the action again, because he spends days sort of grieving over Patroclus, and he defiles Hector's body. He drags him behind a chariot in the dust around Troy, like over and over and over again. And it just horrifies Hector's family, because they want to give him a proper funeral as well, and he's denying that to them. And so it's like the rage of Achilles is the thing that sends the entire Trojan War kind of out of sorts. And then once his rage finally subsides, I think Priam comes up to him and begs him to sort of release Hector's body so they can give him a proper funeral. And that's when, the poem ends. And it's sort of when Achilles' rage subsides finally, and he takes pity on Priam, and he realizes that it's the honorable thing to do to hand over Hector's body so that he can have a proper funeral, because that's sort of the honorable, right thing to do. And by allowing that, it's like things are finally able to progress the way they're supposed to. So the poem doesn't end with Achilles' death at the hands of Paris, and it doesn't end with Odysseus's big wooden horse leading to the final sack of Troy and the burning of the city. We don't see any of that. The poem is about Achilles' rage and the impact that that rage has on the progression of the Trojan War itself. And then when his rage finally subsides, that's when the poem ends, because it's like the proper flow of the war is able to continue. And so even though Achilles makes the decision that sort of dooms him to die young, we don't see his death, but we know it's happening. Right before Hector dies, he reminds Achilles that he's doomed to die young. And there's even a part where like Achilles' horse sort of reminds him that he's going to die, which is kind of fun. It's his rage that is sort of the one thing that's standing between him and his destiny. And so the character arc, because this is Achilles' story, the character arc for Achilles is him finally accepting his destiny and making the decision that allows him to go out in a blaze of glory in a way that he will be remembered forever. And so even though Achilles is a very flawed character and we see him making mistakes, he is still someone that I think people looked up to, because imagine being so gifted and powerful and important that a personal crisis of yours would derail an entire war and cause your side to start losing terribly and lead to the death of your closest friend. And it takes sort of him working through his issues to finally allow like this war to continue on as it should. And so that's why Achilles is a great hero, and that's why we sort of look up to him, and that's why he's sort of cemented as one of the great heroes of Greek mythology. Even though from a modern perspective, reading this poem now, it seems like he's sort of a petty, childish person. But in reality, this is, a 20-something guy who is so powerful and favored by the gods that he controls the tide of an entire war, and we want him to go out in a blaze of glory, because that means that he's making kind of the right decision. If he had abandoned his friends and gone home, he would have lived a long life, but he would have abandoned his friends, they probably would have lost, and he would have been seen as a coward for kind of the rest of his life. So him making the decision to die young, it was very hard for him, but it was ultimately kind of the right choice. So to conclude this discussion, there's a lot of other stuff I could talk about. This poem is huge and complex, and I could go on and on and on and on and on, but I don't want to do that. But to conclude this, I did want to leave you with a few questions, because when you're studying literature, it's not about just having read something. Be like, okay, I've read this, I can move on. I can check it off on a box. Reading literature is about the effect that it has on you, the things that it makes you think about, and the questions that it inspires in you. So I've got 3 questions for you. You can either answer them in the comments if you want, or you can just ignore them and just think about them yourself. But these are kind of 3 things that I want you to think about after having read the Iliad. So question number 1, what do you think sets Achilles apart from the other great heroes in this conflict? There are other characters in the poem who are the sons of gods and goddesses. We've got like Sarpedon, who's a son of Zeus. We've got Aeneas, who's a son of Aphrodite. And there's characters who are given special abilities by the gods, like Diomedes. But what is it that you think sets Achilles apart from all of these other characters and makes him important enough to be a central figure in this poem? Why is he so important to the success of the Greeks? So think about that. Question number 2. What is your opinion of the Trojans? They're the opposing side and the enemies of the Greek army, and we are obviously kind of on the side of the Greek army. We want them to succeed. So why do you think Homer spends so much time humanizing them and showing their honor, their great deeds? We look up to a lot of the Trojan heroes. I really like Aeneas and I really like Hector. And so think about, how do the Trojan characters function in the story? Like, why are they given the treatment that they are, where if you wanted to, you could cheer for them? You're not really supposed to, because the story is supposed to be about the Greeks being successful. Why do you think Homer spends the time he does on humanizing the Trojans and showing that they're good, honorable people? All right, question number 3. Does the story have a primary villain? Who could it be? And also, does the story need a villain? And if you don't think the story has a villain or needs a villain, what is the primary conflict at the heart of the story? And I don't mean just Greeks versus Trojans. I mean, what is the main conflict that drives the action of the story itself within the confines of the Iliad itself? Is there a conflict between a hero and a villain? Is there an antagonist? There's a bunch of characters who do antagonistic things, but who do you think is sort of the main antagonist of the story? Or what is the main antagonist of the story? So think about that. Let me know in the comments. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week. And in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.